So today in Blender, I'm going to show you how you can take an object that is made of multiple materials and multiple textures and reduce that down to only using one material and one texture, but still maintain the way that it looks. Fortunately, Blender has some nice built-in tools to do exactly that. So what we're going to do is first take a look at this sample object that I made, which is just a couple of objects jammed together, and then I trimmed it up a little bit. You can see there are not a lot of interior faces, but um, I've differentiated the parts by material. So if I go ahead and look at the material tab over here, I have three parts, part A, B, and C. Let's switch to shading mode. And you can see that part A is this part made of these wood planks, which over here you can see is this texture here. It's a tiling texture. Part B is identical in terms of its shader setup. It's using different texture though. And part C is using concrete textile texture. Now what we need to do is get all of these materials, textures into one big image, and we need to redo the layout of how they fall on this object. Now that's done by switching to the Object Data Properties tab, which is the little green triangle guy, and we're going to switch to UV editing mode so we can really take a look at this. What I've got here, when I go into edit mode with the tab key, is I can select a face and see exactly where it is on its UV layout. So over here on the left window, if I select everything with A and I hit G, as I move this around, you can see the texture sliding around that face. I can do the same with any of these parts. And when you click on something that has a different material on it, Blender's smart enough to switch the view over here to know that it uses a different material and a different texture. You can also do that with the whole cylinder part. I'm going to select one of these faces over here and hit Control L. That will select all the linked parts of this thing. And now you can see as I slide this around, the material is actually updating in the other viewport, so you can see the texture slide around. If you select everything, you can see that they're all overlapping within their respective UV space, which is always a square here. What we need to do is get all of these parts laid out in unique positions on one giant texture. But as I said, doing that manually would be a really tricky process. So what we need to do first is take a look at the UVs themselves. Like I said, if you're in the object data properties and you expand this little triangle that says UV maps, you'll notice that there is a default set of UVs for this thing called UV map. I don't really like that name. I like to change it because I'm going to be making a new set of UVs, which are just texture coordinates, two-dimensional coordinates to show where textures should lie on the object. So I'm going to rename this one UV map underscore original, just so I know not to mess that one up. And then I'm going to hit the little plus over here that will add a new UV map. Now when you do that, it doesn't add a blank UV map. In fact, it just duplicates the original one and gives it a unique name, in this case UV map, because it wasn't taken anymore. I'm going to rename this, and I'm going to put an underscore after it and call it baked layout. Now, again, they're identical, so if I were to go into edit mode again and switch between the two, see no change over here on the UV view. But if I were to go into the second set and grab everything in here and say rotate it a bit, now when I go back and forth between these two layouts, you can see it change. That can help you understand the difference between the two layouts. Now, you'll notice nothing changes on the object because when I switch back and forth between these, I'm not actually viewing those UVs on the object. So I've gone ahead and done an undo on that rotation of the layout. But instead, what I'm going to do is relay out the UVs. And the way that's done is by making sure that you are selecting this new layout. going to edit mode on the object. And there's a number of ways you could do this. You could manually move them around. What I'm going to do instead is go to the UV menu and choose Smart UV Project. Now in doing this, this is basically going to automatically lay out all the different parts in one big sheet. I like to add a little bit of a margin, like 0.1. That way none of the pieces are overlapping at all, and we have a little bit of cushion around them. And then I'm going to hit OK, and we'll watch what happens in the left side viewport. Aha, now it might be a little tricky to see right now, but what it's done, change this view so you can see it. Just switch this view, that helps. You can see all the pieces now are laid out in a different way than they were before. Now again, it's not affecting these objects in the view here at all because they're still using the original layout. If I switch over to that, you can see they're still in their original position. Here they're laid out differently. This is the layout I'm going to use for single material, single texture. Now you might be wondering, well, they're way smaller than they were when they were like this, so isn't that going to make the textures much more zoomed in and all that? And you'd be right. But after we do a special process, I'm going to fix that for us. So let's take a look at one other detail here. One thing that I noticed is that when I did this automatic layout, some parts that used to be straight are curved, and something like this cylinder cap, which is a perfect circle, has become sort of oblong, an oval. That's not really what I wanted, but it's nothing to worry about because the next process is going to fix those things automatically. Just so that you understand, if you had decided not to change the size of any of these pieces or the orientation of any of these pieces, another way that you could have done it, instead of doing the automatic Smart UV Project, is you could have just gone over here and said, hey, go to UV and just pack all the islands at their current orientation. And you can still add a little bit of padding down here if you want. And for something like this, that might actually be a better way to do it. But that's up to you. You can experiment with all the different ways. There's so many different ways of packing the UVs. One of them is called light map pack, which will really split it up into individual triangles and polygons. And so when I hit that, it does something like this, which makes parts of it not even recognizable anymore, but that's okay. So I'm just showing you a couple different ways. Regardless of how you lay out the UVs, the next step is really important. We have two sets of UVs, original and a baked layout. And again, you can toggle between them. You're in edit mode and you'll see them. We want to make sure that we have the new one selected. That's really important. But next, we need to go back to our shading mode and be a little more explicit about the UVs that it's using for the current setup. Now, right now, it defaults to whatever the first UV set is in here. But I like to add, you can type in here, UV map. I like to add a UV map node where I explicitly tell it the original layout and then pipe that into the image texture. Nothing will change on the model. It might flicker for a second, but now we're making sure that the way that it looks now is because it's using the original UVs. I'm going to do that to all three parts, all three materials. Right now I did that only on part B, but I can go to the material tab, switch to part A, and do the same thing. It's a lot easier if you just copy the one you already have with Control V, Control C, and then paste with Control V. Type that same original layout for all the parts. That might seem unnecessary, but you'll see why I did it in a minute. Switch back to part A. The next thing we're going to do is do what's called a bake. And it's kind of a weird word, but it's basically trying to take all these textures and render them onto a new texture. So the way we do that is we start with a target, and the target is going to be a new image node. So I go to add texture, image texture. And it starts out empty. So I'm going to click New on it and make a file that I'll call baked texture. And the size of this matters. If we want a decent resolution, I'm probably going to go with double what I have now. This says 1024. I actually want 2048, which is 2 times that. Here's a little trick for you Blender people. If you leave the original dimension there, 1024, and type asterisk for times 2 and hit enter, we'll double it for you. So it can figure out the math. We don't need any alpha channel, and it'll just be blank. It says here, and we'll hit OK. So baked texture is really visible over here. It's just a blank black texture right now. But what is important is that we tell it which UVs to use. Well, with the help of this UV map node, I'm going to duplicate it with Shift D, slide it over here. Copy paste also would have worked. And I'm going to instead use the UV map baked layout UVs and type that into vector number, this vector slot. So that texture is going to use the new layout. Old material is using the original layout. This one's using the new one. And then the very last thing we need to do is make sure that we have this selected. Selecting the texture in the material editor is really important because that's how it knows where to render when it does the bake. This will make more sense in a minute. The other thing I need to do is make sure that I have these new nodes that I made, the UV map and the new target baked texture, in all of the materials. Right now this is only in part A, so it would only bake out the dark wood one, but I need one for the cylinder part and I need one for the small cube hexagon part. So I'm going to Control C, copy those, go to part B, paste them in. Make sure that bake texture is selected. Do it again here, part C, we're good to go. Now, we need to actually bake the textures out. What does that mean? Well, you'll see. We're going to go to the rendered properties, and we're going to switch our render engine from the EV renderer, which is what we're using now in the viewport, to the cycles renderer. Cycles is generally used for rendering out whole animations and things, but we're going to use it for baking. You can see what it actually would look like if you switch your viewport shading mode over to render mode, which right now looks really dark because I actually don't have any lights in the scene, but it doesn't matter. I just wanted you to see what it looks like. Let's switch back, get a better view. And then the other thing that we're going to do is make sure that when cycles is selected, the device is the CPU as opposed to using the GPU compute. If you have a fast graphics card like I do, you can do lots of cool renders using the GPU, but you can't, as of this video, you can't do any baking of textures or lighting using the GPU. In fact, you'll notice when I switched over to GPU at the bottom here, there was a section called Bake and it's gone. You have to make sure you're on CPU and it'll show up again. Here it is. Once you're in the Bake section, you'll see a couple different things. One of them is Bake Type. And if you look at that drop down, the default is Combined. But you can see that it's possible to bake out only certain parts of your materials, like just the ambient occlusion or just the shadows, things like that. In our case, we don't need lots of stuff. All we need is the one called diffuse, which is really just the color component or the texture component of your material. So I'm going to switch it to diffuse, and underneath that it says influence, direct, indirect, and color. Direct and indirect refer to the actual lighting contribution in the scene. I don't have any lights. I don't care about them. I'm going to turn off direct and indirect and only worry about the color. We're just doing a bake of the color. So what we do next is once again make sure that the target textures are selected. This is the bake texture in part A, B, and C. They're all selected. Then we're going to go back to our render. We're going to hit bake and we'll wait for it. before I do that, sometimes I like to open up this image editor and switch to make sure bake texture is selected so I can actually see it. Then I'll hit bake and wait for it to happen. Now once I hit bake, you'll notice at the bottom of the screen, get a little bit of a progress meter. And this can take anywhere from a few seconds to, I don't know, maybe an hour, depending on how complex your scene is. But this one is really simple. So I'm going to stop and come back when this is done. Okay, so we finished baking out the textures into a new sheet. And you'll see right away, as long as your baked texture is showing in your texture window here, all of the different parts are laid out with the new layout. So you can see the wood parts, you can see the hexagon parts, and you can see the cylinder parts. There are some empty parts, and that's okay. But we're not actually seeing it on the object yet, because our materials for all the parts are still using the original layout, piped through the old material textures, and going into the output. What we need to do now is go through all three parts, change them, use our new texture. So we can do that by going to each part, and instead of using this old one piped in, just pipe the color, the base color, and it should look just about the same. Let's try doing it on part B and also on part C. So now it looks virtually the same, except they're all using one texture. Now, you might be asking, well, why are there still three different materials? Well, you'd be right. We don't need all three materials. We only need one of them. You may want to duplicate this object just in case you need to rebake it or something like that. And then on your duplicate, only use one material. For this demonstration, I'm actually going to just remove part B and C by hitting the little minus here. And now everything is using one material in this guy. And I don't even need these pieces anymore. Let's get rid of them. And we're only using the new UVs. If I zoom in, the baked layout, the baked texture, and it's all one material, one texture. Now, you might ask, well, how do I get like different parts to have different roughness and metallic properties? That's for a different tutorial. For now, you still only have one slider for all of them. And in this case, because I'm really just looking at the base color of the material, you don't necessarily even need this principled BSDF shader type. You could get rid of it and instead use one like diffuse or something like that, where you don't need all the extra fancy information. Of course, now it has no shininess or anything, but it's a very simple model. This would render very quickly in any game engine. It's not that many triangles, and now it's all one material, one texture, and so it's one draw call for your game engine, including hubs. One last thing that's very important that I forgot to mention earlier. After you do your bake and you get this nice layout with your new texture layout and the UVs, very important that you save this image. Right now, it may look as though everything's fine, but if I were to save my Blender file, close Blender, open it up again, I might find that this texture is gone. That's because right now it's just saved in memory, and I need to go into the 2D view here of the texture and go to that little 3 lines hamburger menu, go to Image, Save As, and then make sure that I save the texture out as something. Call it Baked Texture, and a PNG is fine. You can do JPEG, whatever you decide, that your compression. Now when I save my file, I know for sure that this is going to stick around, and I can always load it up again and have no problem. And it's also worth noting that because I've baked the textures to a new UV layout, I don't need the original UV layout anymore. So if you go over to your object data properties and look at the two, I'm using the one called baked layout in my material. I do not need UV map original anymore. I can simply hit the minus to get rid of it. You might want to keep it around, like I said, in case you mess something up or you forgot a step and you need to go back and rebake things. But having only one UV layout is perfectly fine, and all you need is the new one. Now, I was about to export this object to bring into hubs, except that I remembered that in order to have it export correctly to the GLTF format, I need to change the shading type. Right now it's using a diffuse BSDF that I set up. That's actually not going to work properly. Uh, you either want to use a principled BSDF for that reason, or a different type that I'll talk about in another video. But right now I'm going to pipe that back in to the BSDF material. I'm going to turn the roughness all the way up because I don't want any kind of glossy surfaces. And now I'm going to go ahead and say export GLTF and calling this my single material object. Make sure that the format is set to GLTF binary or .glb. That will make it one big file with the material and the texture included in it. Then I can just hit export LTF. Now when I switch over to hubs, where I had my objects before, I can simply find the file. Here it is. It's about 4.8 megabytes, and I can drag it in the hubs, and it should load very quickly. There it is. It is only one material. Therefore, if you look at the calls here, it says 11, whereas before it said 10. I'm only adding one extra draw call to my scene by including this object, and it has all the materials, all the textures that I expected, though it's just one. So that's how it's done. In the next video, I'm going to show how you can actually bake the lighting itself into the textures so that you can have a much more efficient scene like the one I'm in here, where, believe it or not, all this lighting is actually part of the textures.